Well, there's a lot going on in the world of politics, and who better to break it all down for us than Caroline Heldman, professor of critical theory and social justice at Occidental College. Good morning, Caroline. Nice to have you with us this Thursday.
It's wonderful to be here. I think I'm not dressed enough for the holiday yet.
Yeah, you're in your Grinch black, but that's okay. We need a little bit of diversity. Well, never a dull moment in politics. Oath Keepers founder Stuart Rhodes and member Kelly Meggs found guilty, seditious conspiracy, facing 20 years in prison. Put into context how significant this verdict is.
It's highly significant. As you know, there are hundreds of cases involving the January 6th violent insurrection, but this is the highest profile case to date, and they did effectively get their charges. And seditious conspiracy is something that, hails from the Civil War. It's a very difficult case, one that prosecutors have rarely had any success with. So to have success at this high of a level really does not bode well for defendants going forward in the January 6th trials.
Well, yeah, I was going to ask you about that. So how high does this go? And does it put former President Trump and members of Congress involved in January 6th at higher risk of indictment?
It potentially could, because it's important to note that Rhodes was not actually on site. Now, Kelly Meggs was, and Meggs is facing, with all of his charges, 87 years. Rhodes is facing up to 60 years. But he was not on site, but the violence that was inspired didn't matter whether he was there physically engaging in it or not. And I pointed out that Kelly was. This begs the question of whether perhaps John Eastman, Trump's attorney, who was involved in orchestrating this, or even Rudy Giuliani, like, how high will this go? And that is the big question.
Well, but how about the former president?
Well, possibly. I mean, we have the January 6th committee finding that he engaged in criminal conspiracy, and they recommended, they passed those findings along to the Department of Justice. So the question really is whether the DOJ thinks that a very high bar of evidence has been achieved in order to prosecute. And of course, that bar is going to be higher for a former president, as it should be.
So let me ask you about this Insurrection Act, right? It bars those involved in trying to overthrow the government from running or holding office. Do you see the DOJ using this act on the former president and members who participated in January 6th? And if not, why not, if no one is above the law?
Well, because the standard of evidence is simply so high, right? When you're going after public officials at that level, especially a former president, it would be unprecedented, and it would actually set up a precedent of prosecuting a president once they leave office, which opens the door for the DOJ to simply be a partisan tool for presidents moving forward. It's not a precedent we want. But then again, it establishes perhaps a worse precedent of not holding a former president accountable for engaging in criminal action. So this is a tightrope walk for Merrick Garland and the Department of Justice. And it's one, they're just simply not going to pursue this unless they really believe that they have a strong case and will have the outcome that they want.
All right, let's move now to the House, the new House. Kevin McCarthy does not appear to have the votes to become the House Speaker. How unprecedented is this? And what happens if he doesn't get the votes?
Well, we've historically seen revolts in terms of the speakership since the founding of our nation. But this one is interesting in that it's coming from a very conservative flank of his own party. Now, I do think Kevin McCarthy will be the next Speaker of the House. He's dealing with 5 extreme members of his party. And I think what they're doing is they're using this moment to leverage their power. They're getting concessions. They're getting promises from him. But it's also possible, this scenario is also possible, that enough moderate Republicans will band together with Democrats and elect the next speaker, and that would not be Kevin McCarthy. He wants to avoid that, so I'm sure he is bending over backwards to make concessions with the extreme members of his party.
Just out of curiosity, how likely could that be?
Well, it's not incredibly likely, but it's definitely something that McCarthy is using to threaten these more conservative members to say, hey, do you want this scenario? It is a possibility. It could happen.
And it's tricky. How do you deal and reconcile the extremist wing of the party with the moderates? I mean, Kevin McCarthy and other Republicans have taken so much heat for not fully rebuking former President Trump for dining with a bigot and anti-Semite. So what does that tell you about a party that can't condemn dining with a Nazi?
Well, it's a fractured party. It is a party that Donald Trump very clearly pivoted to white supremacists. He wasn't shy about that. And in fact, his recent meeting with Nick Fuentes, who was a guest of Kanye West at Mar-a-Lago, confirms, right, his dog whistle politics, that he's still dabbling, right? He called, basically white supremacists marching in Charlottesville very good people. I mean, just think about his rhetoric over the years. What is he pitching to? We know it from studying racism, and there are many different forms: colorblind racism, Jim Crow racism, aversive symbolic racism. We know that there's a certain chunk of the Republican Party that does hold these beliefs, and it's a higher rate than Democrats, although I would argue racism is everywhere in a country that has stitched it into our founding documents, practices, and rituals. But these Republicans have to walk a fine line between not disaffecting racists, essentially, that Trump is appealing to, and not being the party of racists. So it's a tough position. Kevin McCarthy and moderates are in a position I would not want to be in, but morally, I think they absolutely should be condemning these practices.
So House Democrats pick Hakeem Jeffries to succeed Nancy Pelosi. He'll become the first black lawmaker to lead a party in Congress. How significant?
Very significant. I mean, it's 250 years into our democratic republic, but also generationally, we are seeing Gen Xers and go Gen Xers. It's a moment for him that will be challenging, though, the next 2 years. He's going to have a president from his party, but really no power in the House of Representatives. So the question is what he does from a position of essential powerlessness.
Right. And before I let you go, the Senate passed the Respect for Marriage Act, requiring states to accept same-sex and interracial marriages. 12 Republicans signed on. Mitch McConnell, as you know, did not. But what happens, Caroline, if the Supreme Court does overturn same-sex marriage? Will states be protected still?
That's a great question. So this law does say, look, states have to respect the laws of other states. And it's possible that the Supreme Court could hear a case that comes up and overturn this, and then it would become a battle between the Supreme Court and the Senate, or the legislative branch of government. And I'd like to point out that Mitch McConnell is in an interracial marriage, and he voted this down. I just find that to be, quite remarkable.
Yeah, eyebrow raising for sure. Caroline Heldman with that white Christmas tree behind you. Oh, 'tis the season. Thank you so much, Professor of Critical Theory and Social Justice at Occidental College. Thank you for being with us, and we'll be back.